Hello everyone, my name is Shonda and welcome to my channel Under the Needle. So you guys aren't going to see my face in this video, but I was asked to show how I quilt my quilts using a serpentine stitch. So I just kind of wanted to show you guys that since I was asked. Now my particular machine has a serpentine stitch, so I'm going to turn it on. Now my particular machine has different stitch lengths, it has different stitch widths, so I can control the size of my serpentine stitch. So I'm just going to do a quick row here. So I normally will start in the center of my quilt. So like dead center, that's where I'm going to put my first Now I'm using black thread so you guys can see. So I'll normally do one stitch down the middle. Now I can make this wider or narrower. I normally like mine a little bit wider, a wider serpentine, but you can make yours however you want. So I basically spread my lines evenly throughout the quilt, starting in the middle. So I'll start in the middle, and then I will do one side. And I'll just space them out evenly throughout the quilt. So how I space them really is going to depend on the blocks that I have. But I'll normally, so this, I'm using this as a guide. So I would normally go in and I would do like down the center, and then I'm going to space them evenly, kind of wide. And so I would do this for both sides. So for both sides of the quilt. So then I would be doing, if this was my quilt, I would be doing another line here and then another line here at the edge. And so once I've got all of the wide stitches done, then I go back in and I fill them in. So then I'll go back in and I'll say maybe I'm going to do a stitch halfway, or sorry, do a line of stitching halfway in between the middle and then the first one next to it. And so then I'll do that. And then once I go in, so then I would do another one here. And then once I fill that in, then I go even narrower. So then I might do another line of stitching here. I don't even have my walking foot turned on. And then once I've done that, so I would do one here, then I would do one here, you know, I would fill that in. And of course this would be filled in as well. I would do all that. And then if I want even more, then I'll go in again and do another line in between. And I can just keep doing that. Now if I look at this and I say, you know what, I think I want 3 lines of stitching, then instead of going down the middle, then maybe I'll go a little bit further to the right or to the left and do a line of stitching. And then I can do another one here as well. And then I just keep filling it in until they're as close as I want. right? So I really, theoretically, it would be difficult to get another line of stitching in between these two, so I probably wouldn't go any closer than this. But really, it's kind of organic, and I don't mark it out as ahead of time. I don't do any marking. I just kind of look at the blocks, and I'll just decide where I want to make them, and then I'll just do them at equal intervals wide, and then go back in and fill in those spaces. And you want to do that because your quilt can bunch up. So if I was to just start here and do all these narrow lines of quilting, I risk the possibility that on the backing that things don't go quite as planned. I could have some bunching of my quilt and things like that. So for me, I found that it's better to do wide intervals throughout the whole quilt, and then go back in and fill them in narrower, and then go back in and fill them in narrower again. Each time I go back, I'll make the spacing more and more narrow, but you want to start wide. So that's kind of how I do mine. Now my machine has a serpentine stitch on it, so it's always, going to be very even. And if I want to, I could, for the first pass of very wide stitching, I could use a different stitch width, and then when I go back in, I could use a different stitch width, and then when I go back in again, I could use a different stitch width, and that'll kind of change the serpentine a little bit. Now if someone doesn't have a serpentine stitch on their machine, let's clear this. If you don't have a serpentine stitch on your machine, you can do this manually by just moving your fabric. Now I'm not used to doing that because I don't normally, so this came out pretty horribly. So you might want to practice it a bit. This is how I practice. I just use 2 pieces of felt. I took a craftsy class, and the instructor said that instead of using fat quarters or her actual fabric for her when she's practicing her free motion, that she will just use felt. And I kind of like that idea, so I'm going to try this again. And so you might want to practice too. So of course, that line stitching I just did is going to be harder on a real quilt, and you might have to slow it down. So if you want your serpentine stitch to be smaller, like what my machine did, then of course as you're moving it yourself, you're going to have to make smaller movements. So you might want to just practice that, how much you need to slow your machine down, and then how much you might need to move your quilt sandwich to get smaller peaks and valleys. Now I will say that if you do this, your quilting is gonna be a lot more organic, right? It's gonna look a lot more custom, because of course this is not custom. My machine did this stitching. So anything that if I'm moving the quilt myself to make my peaks and valleys, your stitching is going to be a lot more organic. It's going to look a lot more custom. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. So just, if you want to know how to quilt your quilt on a domestic machine, and you want to use a serpentine stitch, it's definitely something you can do. It's easy to do. You will need a walking foot on your machine to do it. My machine has a built-in walking foot, which is great. But if you have a serpentine stitch, and if you have one, basically it just looks kind of like a squiggle. So when you look at your stitch selection, like mine is just a squiggle line, and that's the serpentine stitch for me. A lot of machines that do have multiple stitches, a lot of them will have a serpentine stitch. So if yours has one, you can use that on the machine, and if it doesn't, like I said, you can do it yourself by wiggling your quilt sandwich and making your own wiggly lines. So for me, that is a super easy way to quilt your own quilt at home and save some money. So that's it for me, and I will see you guys next video.